symposium. Our third session of this symposium is on urban life and examines how epidemic illnesses exploited and amplified social divisions and how epidemic interventions were leveraged against, experienced, and navigated by different communities. In the 4 papers comprising this session, we will explore the impact of pandemics on social practices more generally and on inequality, racial and ethnic tensions, and displacement more specifically, and indeed, more importantly. Our first speaker will be Stefan Pradines, who is a professor of Islamic art and architecture at the Aga Khan University in London. He is a specialist of trade and Islamization in the Indian Ocean from the Swahili coast to the Maldives. He is also a specialist of warfare in medieval Africa. He was the director of the excavations of the walls of Cairo in Egypt from 2000 to 2016. He is now in charge of the excavations of the fort of Lahore in Pakistan.
Good morning or good afternoon. First, I would like to thank Kathleen and Mohamed for inviting me to this fantastic conference. I will speak about Egypt and Cairo, one of the best known and well-documented cities during the medieval Middle East. Next. A well-known history of the Cairo of the Mamluks are the plague epidemic and the Black Death. These plague epidemics were described in detail by historians but never observed physically. During this presentation, I will develop 2 main points. First, how the Mamluks responded to epidemic crisis by changing their Muslim funerary practice. Second, how the plague epidemic impacted and changed the urban history of Cairo. Next. Only sultans and important figures of the empire were buried in mausoleums attached to mosque and madrasa in the city. The rest of the population were buried in the necropolis outside the city. During the medieval period, Cairo has 2 major necropolis or city of death, Karafa al-Kubra and Karafa al-Sugra. They were located outside the city in the desert for sanitation reasons. Next. Wooden coffins were only used to transport the defunts to the cemetery as we do today. The bodies were wrapped in shrouds, keffan, of 1 or 2 pieces of cotton. In Cairo, the bodies are oriented north-south with the face toward the southeast, facing Mecca. In Muslim funerary practice, 1 grave always corresponds to 1 individual. Next. During our field work, we exhumed 2 streets parallel to the city wall built by Salah ad-Din. Modest Mamluk houses were built along these streets in the early 13th century. Al-Makrizi described this zone as Ben and Surain, the area between the walls, the Ayyubid and the Fatimid walls. In 2001, 2002, and 2008, 2009, we excavated a large Mamluk cemetery that was built over the abandoned district of Ben and Surain and the previous occupation. The number of individuals excavated was around 77, but the number of graves identified was much higher, probably around 300, 400 people in the area of the archaeological triangle. The majority of the excavated burials consisted of simple individual graves, and they were not epidemic burials. Next. Nevertheless, we observe many graves or funerary pits in multiple deposits of individuals layered on top of each other or in juxtapositions very close to each other in larger pits. We recorded graves with 2 to 5 individuals in the same pits. These burials have been documented by field anthropologists, and the evidence are clear. The position of the skeletons touching each other but not disturbing the bones, and the absence of soil separating the bodies clearly indicate simultaneous deposition of superimposed individuals and sometimes more. The unusual high number of simultaneous burials is evidence of mortality crisis, probably an epidemic. Next. Several graves contain a blackish residue in contact and around the bodies. This substance could be an application of naphtha or natural oil on the shroud, especially as some bones presented some discoloration showing that they were exposed to fire. Next. As previously mentioned, archaeological data overlaps text of famous medieval chroniclers such as Imdumak or and Imnias. The Great Plague or Black Death from 1349-1365 would have reduced the population of Egypt by a third, and around 1 million people died from it. Egypt also suffered from repeated plague epidemics outbreaks from 1469 to 1513. Thanks to the stratigraphy and the study of archaeological layers, we proved that the cemetery dates from the 14th and 15th century, mainly because the graves were dug over or sometimes through the previous occupation layers dating from the 13th century. Between the late 13th century to the mid-14th century, the eastern district of Bab al-Suren, was abandoned and subsequently fell into ruins. Hence, we have an example of a neighborhood neglected and converted into a cemetery from the mid-14th century to the late 15th century under the Circassian Mamluk. This illustrates the famous ruins of Cairo that was described by al-Makrizi. The plague had a profound impact on the urban landscape, and the entire neighborhoods in eastern Cairo were abandoned. Next. On this Italian map of an Italian spy, Matteo Pagano, the cemetery was still in use in the late 15th and very early 16th century. Next. The map shows the presence of tourbe or mausoleum in the eastern area in Ring. Next. The cemetery was still widely used during the Ottoman period, as it is mentioned on the map of the description of Egypt in 1798-1801. Next. Many graves were still visible on photography in early 20th century. Next. To conclude, first, the cemetery of Bab al-Guhrayib presents serious evidence of the plague epidemics during the 14th and 15th century in Egypt. The cemetery was situated in the city, but this was not the usual practice and correspond to a quick reaction to an epidemic crisis. The excavations revealed mass graves that indicated that groups of people have been buried in the same pit and in a hurry. Some human bones display evidence of being burned. This funerary practice is not usual in Islam and might have been admitted in times of epidemic crisis. As we can see today, Muslim authorities all over the world are responding to COVID-19 by pushing people to stay home and not socialize, even during the period of Ramadan. So the epidemic crisis transcends religion, and people have to adopt a collective response. Our second discovery was to have a better understanding of the limit of the medieval Cairo. Medieval Cairo was much larger than was described by the historians before our research. In 1348, the Black Death had a deep impact on the urban landscape, pushing people to abandon the whole eastern district of the city. Unfortunately, it's the same with the COVID-19. This epidemic will also have a deep impact on our economic and urban life. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Stefan. Our next speaker is Joshua Teplitsky, who is an assistant professor of history at Stony Brook University. He earned a PhD in Hebrew and Judaic studies and history at New York University. His book, Prince of the Press: How One Collector Built History's Most Enduring and Remarkable Jewish Library, was just recently published by Yale University Press in 2019.
In the cities and towns of what was once Habsburg Bohemia and Moravia, the memory of plague was often built into the public spaces of urban life. Looming over many a town square stands a Marian column, a memorial pillar atop which rises the Virgin Mary, glorious in her triumph over two contagions, the heresy of Protestantism and epidemic disease. These columns mingle civic commemoration with imperial pomp and defined the dominant culture of Habsburg urban space in the centuries following the Catholic Counter-Reformation. Like much of the rest of the continent, which experienced an outbreak of pestilence at least once a generation during this period, the cities of the Habsburg monarchy lived under the regular threat of disease. Epidemics struck in 1649, in 1679-80, and one final time in the late summer of 1713, the outbreak which I will focus on in my remarks today. While the Marian columns of the city represent collective piety of its Catholic majority, they obscure the epidemic experiences of a sizable population that lived outside of the Catholic fold, its large Jewish community. The apparent collective grace expressed by these civic memorials stand in stark relief to the ways in which the plague affected minorities, both as victims of epidemic trauma, as well as discriminatory human-made policies to which it was subjected. Yet to be a minority was not necessarily to be subject to popular uprising and violence, nor did it demand absolute hostility. In this brief presentation, I will focus on the city of Prague in the year 1713, to explore the ways that moments of plague engendered instances of discrimination, but also reveal points of cooperation and coexistence, as epidemic history serves as a useful, if painful, point of entry to contemplate both. Prague had featured a Jewish presence since the early Middle Ages, and by the start of the 18th century, the number of Jews had risen to over 11,000, making the Jewish population nearly a third to a quarter of the total urban number. A tolerated minority in the city, in fact more tolerated than Protestants, Jews enjoyed the formal protection of the Habsburg monarchs on account of their economic utility. Prague's Jewish ghetto, which is here, give or take, held a semi-autonomous status marked both spatially and politically, and was separated from the rest of the city, accessible through gates. It had its own town hall, in which sat a Jewish elected leadership, its own places of worship, a separate welfare sector of schools, midwives, apothecaries, and surgeons. But it was also an overcrowded site, with thousands of residents distributed through only a few hundred buildings. When the plague struck Prague in July of 1713, the Habsburg offices paid particular attention to this crowded urban area. Edicts issued from the capital in Vienna regularly offered a set of instructions to the city of Prague as a whole, followed by a subset of orders to be imposed upon the Jewish town in particular, motivated by a desire to protect the non-Jewish residents of the city from excess association with Jews. This was felt, for example, most palpably when, on the 23rd of August, Habsburg policy crystallized around issues of enclosure, quarantining, and the shuttering of spaces. Within this policy, there was a marked difference between the Jewish neighborhood and the rest of the city. While the prescribed course of action for the city called for the sealing of individual homes, for the Jewish quarter, a wholesale enclosure of the entire neighborhood was mandated. Such attempts to manage city space had unforeseen consequences for the movement of individuals. Repeated edicts sent from Vienna to Prague in the later weeks of August of 1713 and the start of September revealed that the closure of the ghetto was only slowly accomplished. This in turn resulted in movement, inward migration of masses of vagrant Jews who had been driven from the countryside into the city, as well as the flight out of the city of wealthier Jews towards safer, unafflicted locales, both of which the monarchy feared would transport infection onward. In dealing with these flows of mobility, the state did not adopt a pre-formed policy. Its response evolved over time. In the first weeks of the epidemic, the state initially defended Jews' ability to travel with limited hindrance, and only later pivoted towards a sweeping ban on all forms of Jewish mobility, even for those carrying documentation attesting to their movement from unaffected places. It thus bears noting that in contrast to the infamous Black Death, neither state nor society directed its unbridled angst against the Jewish population. And while the ghetto may have been subject to neglect, it was never the victim of direct assault or physical persecution. Moreover, to the eye of the historian, both the enclosure of the space of the ghetto and the curtailment of Jewish mobility beyond the city offer evidence of segregation as a concerted project to change the norm. The regulations that limited Jewish-Christian contact can be productively read by historians to offer evidence for the bonds of neighborliness that preceded the crisis. This is evident, for example, from edicts demanding a cessation of mingling between Christian and Jewish domestic servants, especially washerwomen, from which we can deduce evidence for the rhythms of normal social contact. The same holds on the opposite end of the social spectrum, as when an edict condemned, quote, those healthy Jews, end quote, who in their flight from the city feared for the belongings they would necessarily leave behind, and deposited their goods not with other Jews, but with Christian householders in the healthier areas outside the Jewish town. And so although the state condemns such a practice, its very mention reflects long-standing relations between at least some denizens of the city and of trust across confessional lines, not of unmitigated hostility. The Prague Plague of 1713 claimed a third of the lives of the city's residents, a proportion that roughly obtained throughout the neighborhoods. For the Jews, a combination of long-standing urban neglect and direct discrimination resulted in not only a horrific number of deaths, but also in the erosion of institutional order, in chaos, and in emotional and psychological trauma, as well as lasting guilt and pain at the indignity in which the dead were cared for. And this was not the end of their troubles. A month after the worst of the plague subsided, the authorities began to devise a strategy to further reduce the Jewish population of Prague through legislation. What might we learn then from this episode for the COVID pandemic? We would of course be rash to draw immediate lines from past to present, but the archival history of differentiated policies as they apply to different social spaces and different communities might give us pause in thinking about the present. My goal in this presentation has been to gesture towards the dynamics and dynamism of plague response in this urban center, and to think about how a view from minority experience exposes inconsistencies and preconceptions of policymakers on the one hand, and social contexts on the other. We are reminded from the case of Prague in 1713 that not every epidemic eventuates in wide-scale violence, yet we must also be attuned to the vulnerability of minorities outside the perceived mainstream to be neglected by public health works or to disproportionately feel the impact of an epidemic. One lesson, I think, then, is to attend to the array of pressures at work, psychological, cultural, institutional, social, and economic, that compound the experience of epidemic. Aspects of the handling of epidemic in the 18th century scenario offered quite a dull instrument, condemning entire neighborhoods or entire subsets of the population, which caused great hardship, even as it may, but only may, have contributed to the overall public health of the city. We can learn from the past to be attentive to difference and to think not only about the politics of blame, but also the politics of indifference, relegation, and neglect, of leaving some populations to fend for themselves without the full arsenal of the resources available for the common good. The encounter between Jews and Christians in plague-ridden Prague can also give us occasion, though, to look beyond statistics and prescriptive policy, to sensitively uncover longer and deeper rhythms of engagement, and to consider the domains in which neighbors across social divides shared urban spaces, to think about the structures of daily and civic life that brought them together. Because much as the Habsburgs might have liked, disease seldom respects walls, boundaries, or borders, and we are only as healthy as our least healthy neighborhood. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Fezanur Karachalioglu, who earned a BA in History and Byzantine Archaeology and Art History from the Heidelberg University and an MA degree in History from the Bogazici University in Istanbul. Her research is focused on the history of the Latins in the Ottoman Empire and the social, cultural, and urban histories of medicine.
Hello, thank you, and welcome to my presentation. I'll talk about the early 19th century Frankish district of Istanbul, Galata. It is usually studied and known for its Catholic landscape and multicultural urban space. Galata was also a landscape of disease, and plague had a highlighted presence. With the second pandemic, it never left the city until the strict quarantine measures were started to be implemented from the end of 1838 onwards. Next slide, please. The fact that from the 18th century on, plague subsided in Europe led to a significant divergence in its epidemiological experience. So in Europe, it came to be associated with the Levant. Nükhet Varlık speaks of a spatial anchoring in this regard. In addition, the concepts of progress and civilization, and also poverty, started to be given as reasons for the occurrence of plague. The Orient and plague were thought of as belonging with each other due to the perceived Islamic fatalism, inefficient governments, and the absence of the institution of quarantine and lazarettos. Istanbul, Cairo, and Alexandria were thought to be the places of plague's origin. Istanbul proper was the old triangular-shaped city on the peninsula. Beyond the Golden Horn was the walled city of Galata, established by the Genoese during the Middle Byzantine period. The area was scarcely settled before then, and used during the first pandemic to bury the corpses. During the second pandemic, Usually people who died from plague were buried in the Christian and Muslim cemeteries of Pera, the extramuros extension of Galata, where gravestones would inform on the death cause. They served at the same time as spaces for people to go on a promenade, although they were also associated with the miasmas. Slide, please. Galata was densely built and populated. The majority of the newer buildings were made of timber. The cracks in them happened to be the optimal places for flea eggs to grow, and the streets were waterlogged, unpaved, and narrow. Pera had begun to develop as the faubourg of Galata, among others, as a result of the wish to avoid plague. So it does not surprise that several churches and altars here were dedicated to the plague saints or the Panaya. Slide, please. There were plague hospitals in the district administered by the Christians. These hospitals received who could not afford private medical care. It was the priests who took care of the patients. They would also be the ones keeping the track of the disease and spreading the news about it. They would also lead the funerary processions, carrying a long stick to ensure the distance and warn the passers-by that a plague victim was being carried to be inhumed. They were known for their courage, but they themselves were convinced that they were being saved thanks to God's favor upon them. Nonetheless, people did fear these hospitals as much as they feared plague and would rather avoid walking past them. They were considered as the portals to the grave. The northern end of the main artery in the district, with its cemeteries and hospitals, was a gloomy place where the phantom of the plague resided. In the European accounts, we encounter the evaluations of the district which reflect interest in hygiene. In the 19th century, hygiene indicated, as Jan Kisatsky writes, I quote, the rules structuring the healthy interaction of people with their environment, unquote. In our context, habits of hygiene included the practice of quarantine and the related sanitary measures. Wearing the waxed, black taffetas cloaks outside counted among these, but one had to endure being subjected to ridicule in Istanbul. Galata Pera was a place where people with different approaches to plague met each other. They appeared to be distinct in themselves to such an extent that they could correspond to ethno-religious groups or were presented as such. Whether one imposed self-quarantine or not, and whether one feared the plague or not, were the points to which much attention was paid. Accordingly, one is presented with a spectrum of reactions ranging from total reliance on the providence and predestination, which was associated with the Muslims in the first place, to the extremes of panic and anxiety, which were associated with the Europeans and the Levantines. Slide, please. People's socioeconomic background determined their roles in the days of plague as well. The better of families, especially the embassies, European merchants, and the Levantines, would leave Galata Pera in the plague season and settle in the northern villages on the Bosporus. Slide, please. They were quite lucky to claim their air, space, and light, which helped them avoid contagion. But ironically, these villages provided the less lucky people with a destination as well. On these hills, one could also come across plague or cholera patients abandoned and hidden by their families. Slide, please. To turn back to Galata Pera, all the business relations and tasks had to continue. The Levantine or European shop owners would hire non-Muslim Ottomans, be they locals or migrants from the archipelago or Anatolia, to engage in buying and selling in the city. Families who stayed in Pera would employ their servants and maids for the supplies, but keep looking at them with suspicion because they would not count on their caution and think they would keep it a secret if they caught the disease. If a death from plague took place in a house, every member would start living in tents till the house and the family's possessions were disinfected. The seamen made up also a group which was the most subject to infection and suspicion. Sharing the same space with them was seen as a potential danger. And there were the dragomans and Catholics from the city proper, where it was impossible to avoid human contact and where people wouldn't care about the precautions. Every Perrault house would be locked up, and every visit would put the families in fear. If one were let in, they would be first taken into a fumigation booth. The fear of plague hindered the social life clearly, with no social gathering taking place, plagues being the concluding theme of every conversation and no shaking hands. In the beginning of the 19th century, we encounter only a limited number of cases where the state intervened in the urban life due to plague. People were not forced to move out of the center, it was their choice. But from the late 1830s on, we see that in the empire, the emergence of the discourse on public hygiene was directly related with the fight against plague and the implementation of the quarantine measures, which were known as the Frankish measures, hence with the attempt to synchronize with Europe and belong to the, in quotation marks, healthier part of the world. So the experience of plague was accompanied by a change in the mindset as well. the conceptualization of and the narratives around plague should be deemed equally important. Studying plague in Pera can be a relevant historical example to illustrate that emotional and practical reactions to contagious diseases influence experiencing and thinking about cities. Pera was a place people could associate with abandonment, untimely death, and danger due to plague. The fear of contagion and the distrust regarding the other's caution restricted experiencing the city freely and socially. The question of the practice of regulated isolation may divide not only the globe, but the cities and neighborhoods into zones of health and disease, and the zones of peacefulness and anxiety to die again. As far as Istanbul was concerned, the role of the adaptation of the quarantine measures, the changes that occurred in the urban structure with regard to the choice of construction material, orderly paving of the streets was obviously great. The experience of plague did lead to the processes of medicalization of space, so medical theories found themselves a place as red threads to be followed once the state decided to fight the spread of plague. We may witness similar processes and trends in terms of learning from each other. Social distance, disinfection, and limitation are establishing themselves as keywords like they have done before, perceiving the cities with certain pathogenic and benign characteristics, not only of the landscapes, but also of the habits of the population, would be again among the major reasons for urban changes. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Fezanur. The last presentation in this session on urban life will be presented by Desiree Valadares, who is a landscape architect and a PhD candidate at UC Berkeley. Her dissertation is attentive to federal preservation policy as it intersects with indigenous land claims and Asian North American redress and war memory. She places her legal and geographic focus on two former US territories, Hawaii and Alaska, and unceded lands in Canada's British Columbia.
Hi everyone, I'm Desiree, and this is Tropical Disease and Prisoners of War in the American Pacific, 1941 to 1946. Next slide, please. So before he cooked up green eggs and ham or taught us how to count colorful fish, Dr. Seuss was a captain in the US Army. And during World War II, this author and illustrator, whose given name was Theodore Geisel, spent a few years creating training films and pamphlets for the troops. One of Geisel's army cartoons was a booklet aimed at preventing malaria outbreaks among GIs by urging them to use mosquito nets and keep covered up. Next slide, please. One of his brochures read, and I quote, "This is Anne. She drinks blood. Her full name is Anopheles mosquito, and she's just dying to meet you. Her trade is dishing out malaria. If you take a look at the map below, you can see where she hangs out." End quote. In this map, the Asia and Pacific region are shaded a blood red and identified as a malaria hotspot. Next slide, please. Today, I focus on this region to tell you about the capture and oceanic transport of World War II prisoners of war in the Pacific, and I hope to offer some insight into the longer history of emergency oceanic jurisdiction during wartime, in addition to the medical treatment of military, civilians, and non-citizen enemy alien bodies. And finally, I also hope to let you know about the use of DDT and other insecticides used by the US military to prevent the introduction and spread of tropical diseases. And I'm particularly interested in oceanic routes in the South Pacific, where combatant and non-combatant prisoners of war were transported by ship to US military installations in Hawaii and the mainland, including Angel Island in San Francisco. Prisoners of war typically included men, women, children. Some were combatants, non-combatants, while others were labor conscripts. And they were mostly captives of Asian descent from Taiwan, Okinawa, Japan, Korea, Saipan, Rota, and the Philippines. Next slide, please. Once captured, prisoners of war were transported to either stationary or roving US Navy medical ships, where they were vaccinated and sprayed with DDT, or dichloro-diphenyl trichloroethane, to control typhus-carrying lice, to stamp out mosquito-borne malaria and other tropical diseases such as filariasis, which was an infectious parasitic disease caused by a roundworm infection. And the US Army's medical department and medical corps policy on sanitation and preventative medicine during the Second World War conflated mosquitoes and other insect-borne diseases with imperial threats. Next slide, please. The military warned soldiers about the dangers of the disease with a very aggressive propaganda campaign that tried a variety of approaches, including patriotic appeals, racist caricatures, scare tactics, and goofy cartoons. These wartime posters by Theodore Geisel or Dr. Seuss depict the Asian or Japanese body and the mosquito of the Anopheles genus as similarly deadly enemies that require elimination. Next slide, please. So DDT was widely used to control malaria and typhus. The US military typically used aerosol versions and dustings on captured prisoners of war in an attempt to curb the spread and transmission of mosquito and insect-borne diseases. Next slide, please. And the US Army developed printed instructions to properly fumigate human bodies. The discourse of sanitation and disinfection through fumigation was applied not only to captured prisoners of war, but also extended to soldiers, civilians, as well as land masses and coastal waters. And it's clear that the military responded to the malaria outbreak with a full-on assault. The Army's medical department dispatched malaria control units to war zones to clear and clean out standing water and bombard malarial areas with insecticides like DDT in bug bombs. With the access to quinine cut off by the Japanese conquest of Java, the government sped up trials of the anti-malaria medicine Adabrine. Despite side effects such as turning the skin yellow, millions of tablets of the drug were distributed to troops toward the end of the war. And this discourse of ridding one's body of contagion mirrors current remarks about ingesting disinfectants, including hydrochloroquine, to prevent COVID-19. The president and his administration has compared the fight against COVID to war and has incited racial tensions by declaring it the Wuhan virus. Next slide, please. So during the war, DDT also began to work its magic on the home front. Newspapers reported that in applications across the US, the pesticide was killing malaria-carrying mosquitoes throughout the South and preserving Arizona's vineyards, West Virginia's orchards, Oregon's potato fields, Illinois' cornfields, and Iowa's dairies. It was deemed a magic mist that had the potential to secure and sanitize one's suburban domestic space with, and I quote, just a twist of the wrist. It was quickly deemed a war-born miracle, so effective one could scarcely believe it. Next slide, please. So in wartime, DDT saved lives, but it did so by inflicting easily accepted collateral damage. In peacetime, however, DDT's negative effects on insects, birds, wildlife, and ecosystems warranted renewed consideration. When the War Production Board initially released DDT for sale to the public, it cautioned against the use of it to upset the balance of nature, and added that if DDT was applied to the body, it could leave residues that might cause harm. Next slide, please. So with very little testing or conclusive results, this insecticide was used widely during World War II, not just in the Pacific region, but all across Europe and North America and elsewhere. And it was used not only on prisoners of war, but also on the shores and territories and possessions of the Pacific. DDT seeped into these islands' lands and waters as makeshift camps and army hospitals popped up in close proximity to Honolulu Harbor in the then territory of Hawaii, which was under martial law. In these spaces, prisoners or prisoners of war were refumigated, their stool and blood tested, and they were further segregated or sorted to be shipped off to immigration stations or internment camps in the US mainland. In other instances, they were taken to the archipelago's longest running prisoner of war camp called Honouliuli. Next slide, please. And the COVID crisis has prompted me to take a closer look at the US Army Corps of Engineers sanitation plan for Honouliuli camp, pictured here. And the camp held prisoners of war across the Pacific, Japanese civilians who were deemed suspicious, and African-American infantry unit who guarded these racialized people were also stationed here. The sanitary and layout plan reveals how disparate populations were further segregated on land. This camp was located in the remote sugar plantations of Oahu's fertile inland plains, far away from the coast. And these strategies of segregation and concealment serve to prevent the spread of tropical diseases and keep this population relatively secluded from the rest of the island. And the spatial layout of the camp, though loosely guided by the stipulations of the Geneva Convention of 1929, shows how contagion, sanitation, waste, and disposal were intimately controlled and managed by the US military during wartime. Thank you very much.